Welcome back. So now we're going to talk about network strategy. And network strategy is different from the other levels of analysis of strategy because we're going to talk about should we compete with other firms and how, which is of course different from corporate level strategy, where do we compete, what should be the scope of the firm, business level strategy, how do we compete, with what competitive advantage, and functional strategies, deploying which resources and competencies. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the discrete versus the embedded organization perspective. Then we'll talk about network strategies, and then we'll go into clusters. So discrete versus embedded organization perspectives. Okay. We look at this almost from a perspective of inter-organizational relations. To an extent, companies can choose, but they're also forced to interact with a large number of organizations and individuals in their environment. Think of the stakeholder model that I presented earlier in this course. The goal of the stakeholder model is to configure external actors in such a way that the organization can manipulate and kind of gel those interests of the stakeholders for the benefit of the corporation. Now, understanding your relationship with stakeholders can take on two very different approaches. You can look at discrete organizational perspective or the embedded organizational perspective. So let's talk first about the discrete organizational perspective. Pens are awful. All right, so the discrete organizational perspective. So here are some assumptions about the discrete organizational perspective. First of all, firms compete in a hostile market, meaning you have an assumption of neoclassical economics where competition is generally seen to be a zero-sum game. And firms have clear boundaries. Think of the differentiated individual ontology that I talked about in some of my ethics videos. But you are clearly in this firm and you are clearly in that firm, and there's very little overlap between them. And strategy, of course, takes a very Porterian approach. I have to engage, defeat, and destroy the competition. Okay. Now, we talk about discrete because in this case, the firm is seen to be in some way detached from the environment. Of course, a firm has to kind of collate its organizational power as much as it can to avoid any sort of resource dependence, meaning that they don't want to have too much dependence on another firm. They don't want to be too closely linked with them. They want to avoid information leaks. Some implications of this model. You want to maximize your bargaining power. I mentioned the independence. Don't get too dependent on any single stakeholder. And collaborative arrangements are exclusively tactical. They're not seen as strategic. Now, contrast this with what we know as the embedded organization perspective. So maybe you watch my ethical video, in my ethics videos, I might talk about this as the differentiated relational ontology. The assumptions here are kind of in contrast to neoclassical economics. The market's not really atomistic, but there are degrees of relationality and networks between firms. So firms and actors can have common goals and they can benefit from cooperation, and business can be a positive sum game. Think of resource-based view, except for the fact that you're not combining resources. Instead, what you're doing is combining resources between firms in order to kind of grow the economic pie, so to speak. So embedded organizations are kind of in a web of mutually dependent organizations, or as DiMaggio and Powell talk about, an organizational field. So the implications are that long-term cooperative relationships should be established. And interdependence and specialization within the network are totally fine. Being dependent on others can be a good thing because they're also dependent on you. And collaborative arrangements are long-term and therefore strategic. Okay. One great example of an embedded organization, because most firms are actually participating in the discrete organizational perspective, but a great example is Ducati. It's an Italian motorcycle company. Now Ducati I also use a lot as an example of transaction cost economics too. And so these kind of concepts can relate. Ducati only has about 1,000 employees in-house. And all they do is the R&D, the design, so quality control, marketing, a little bit of testing, and then also the networking activities, particularly with the website and the ads. Now within their network, they have 180 suppliers representing 90% of the total production cost. The network also does distribution and the stores themselves. And they have a whole bunch of partnerships in R&D and marketing too. And you're probably asking, wait a second, doesn't the transaction cost get like way out of hand? Isn't this a bad idea for Ducati? No, because they all look at themselves not as discrete organizations. If they did look at themselves as discrete organizations, yeah, there would be significant trust issues which would boost up the cost of each transaction. But because they're looking at each other within an embedded organization approach, they're all members of the same web and they all focus on working together. Now I mentioned in the last module there's some strategy research talking about contract completeness versus trust. A big part of the network advantage is that you do trust your partners to an extent. You almost have a teamwork approach versus contracts which are focusing on kind of delineating clear boundaries. But nonetheless, there is this tension between independence and embeddedness. The value of independence is that you can look at generating scale economies within the firm. And of course, there is a lot of dispersion of your partners. And we can look at, again, maintain that arm's length relationship. But embeddedness also has some advantages. You can specialize within the network, so you can benefit from a learning curve. And of course, you can benefit from potential geographical or cultural proximity of your partners, meaning you kind of trust your partners and you operate in the same network. So I've just talked about discrete organizational perspective and embedded organizational perspective. Next thing we're going to talk about is network-based strategies. I'm looking forward to seeing you then.